I've heard very interesting opening speeches here at the on Saturday that made it even more apparent of why we should be talking about climate finance and finance for biodiversity. And that was that the time is over for incremental change. We need transformational change in these systems in order to tackle both crises, the climate crisis as well as the biodiversity crisis. We here at GCF, we're thinking about transformational change as paradigm shift in low emission and climate resilient development pathways. This is the goal, this is the overarching aim and objective of the fund. For those that don't know, the GCF is the funding mechanism, the financial mechanism under the UNFCCC. And I felt this was a very interesting conversation to be had here today to look at the private sector. So the IU that I represent, the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund, has recently conducted an evaluation on the private sector approach. How do we get the private sector to come to the table and to the conversation? And this is the presentation I'd like to show here right now. So our colleague in Seoul, if you could change the slide, that would be great. From this perspective, I just wanted to say, so we've done this evaluation and we discerned 5 core provisions from the GCF mandate. So the GCF as a climate fund looks at channeling private sector finance, including catalyzing that finance. It's not only leveraging the finance, but it's catalyzing the finance. It also pursues a very country-driven approach. It looks at a geographical and thematic balance, and it looks at the question of how are we supporting enabling environments. So these are the 5 things that I would really briefly like to talk about here today. And the first slide is telling you a little bit about this landscape, this question of if we are to provide finance flows consistently for these goals that I just spoke about, the low emission as well as climate resilient development pathways, there's a couple of things that we know in the literature that tells us what one would need. It needs this shift, this paradigm shift. It needs catalyzing finance, do some say from WRI as well as from the OECD. It needs innovative financial instruments. It also needs a transition of the entire financial system, so a greening of the financial system. And it requires all of us in the profession, in the different professions, to take climate change and biodiversity into account. So basically, to make it relevant in the conversations that we have. And lastly, it requires a lot of work on the enabling environments and the engagements with the stakeholders on the ground, as well as on levels at policy level and other levels. Next slide, please. So let me introduce you, next slide, please. This is fine, next slide. Let me introduce you very briefly to 5 key conclusions that we draw from our evaluation. So what we found when looking at the GCF and how the GCF tries to bring private sector to the conversation of climate, on a climate finance, we found 6 things, and I'm talking about these 6 things very briefly. First, be the catalyst. So we found that currently at the GCF, it is unclear of how we're dealing with this mandate of leveraging private sector finance, but also how are we catalyzing quality finance, if you like. How are we catalyzing private sector finance? And that's to do with the engagement that you would require on the ground. A second part that we found is that if you want to be successful in project development, it is very important that these processes are country-driven. So you need to get the stakeholders in the country on board, and most often this can be done through planning and adequate planning at country level. We found that the GCF struggles with this time and time, in particular when it's multi-country approaches. We've heard this yesterday. I was at an event of the Yellow Sea with IUCN. We have a speaker here today. It is remarkable that in biodiversity, some projects clearly show that we can work on transboundary issues, and we can work on things that show us that nature is nothing. Nature doesn't know borders. So it is something that we clearly see that we need to work across borders, and we need to have transboundary issues brought up far higher in this conversation. A third part that we found is when we come to climate finance and the public institutions, it's often a culture shock that we see when working together with the private sector. And this culture shock is explained through the operations that we have. We often have very lengthy, very administrative processes with little foresight and predictability for the private sector. And we found that to be most often the deterrent for private sector to co-invest with actors such as the Green Climate Fund. The fourth part that I want to bring to you here, the fourth comment and conclusion, is this question of capacity. You can often build capacity in various settings for various things, technical things most often, and that is good. But what we found is when it comes to private sector engagement and projects that would involve private sector finance, it is something else is required, and it is this policy enabling environment. So the capacity for policy work is often forgotten and is often limited to drive policy and regulatory reforms that would help allow certain asset classes to come about in nature in particular, and that would then allow the private sector to invest. Next slide, please. The last two key conclusions that I have here are on, next slide, please. Thank you. Are on the question on local action. So finance is often local, and we forget about that very easily. We think about bigger funders that would fund projects, but at the end of the day, in most climate projects that are very complex because they involve multiple sectors, we found it requires a lot of transactions in local currencies, transaction in local markets, for which you need local financial intermediaries. So you need to think about finance as well and private sector finance at the local level. In addition to this, you acquire an engagement with local private sector that would actually implement the project on the ground. So it requires the MSMEs, in particular in vulnerable countries, that are activated to work with you on climate action. And lastly, it's again this enabling environment, and this is what we found in particular when referring to the question of adaptation. We still see that mitigation projects are far easier for the private sector to finance. Adaptation projects are lagging behind, and most often this is also due to the fact of creating these markets and helping the enabling environment to help these markets to be financeable. So what does that all mean? And I have got another slide that I would like to show. So next slide, please. And that is basically the recipe, as I call it, 6 recommendations that we brought to the GCF for climate that I believe are also could also be transferred to biodiversity finance. So first of all, we need to recognize that we are working in an area with high risk. And for that, we need actors that are ready to take that risk. And in addition to this, to work on the catalyzing of finance, so quality finance, if you like, not the leverage that we most often look at. Secondly, it's about the predictability. So again, as you've heard me speak about culture, we need to ensure that these processes are clear, transparent, and predictable for these actors. We need to ensure that these are country-owned, and country ownership most often comes through a verbalization of plans, national adaptation plans, national wetland plans, national designated contributions, the NDCs. Fourth, we need to create an institutional organizational structure that helps these private sector activities to come about. And that speaks as well to the last two, which is that we need to think about strategizing how to involve local private sector in our considerations, and how to actively engage with them by also providing financial instruments that make sense to those private sector actors in the countries. With that, I conclude, and I'm very pleased to discuss with you what can we do for mobilizing private sector in biodiversity. I hope this has been engaging. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter will be Dr. Lifeng Li, and we asked him what are some of the key challenges with regards to finance in the wetlands conservation.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thanks very much, colleagues, and great pleasure to join this discussion. I was in GCF shortly for 3 years, but before that, I spent 15 years on wetlands use, wetlands conservation. But at least I can share with you some of my own observations on this subject. Before talking about the financing wetlands conservation, let me step back. Let's look at how many of the wetlands challenges we're facing today just because of the financing in the past. And certainly we are not lack of those examples that, the big project, whether it's a flood levee, flood control levee, or, defense coast along the coast, or it's a big infrastructure, or it's a water diversion, or all these kinds of infrastructures. Certainly, don't get me wrong, we certainly need infrastructures to meet the social economic objectives. There's no doubt about that. Everyone come to here, because we rely on certain infrastructures. However, many of the infrastructures, especially those next to the wetlands, have significant impact on wetlands. We see the dams. Yes, the dams produce cheap electricity, renewable, and also supply the water for drinking, for irrigation, for agriculture. But also many of those dams blocked, destroyed or affect the wetland systems. And we are not lack of those kinds of examples. We are not lack of examples that agriculture has been expanded to the areas that they should not be, expanded to. I think we're really, facing those challenges, and hopefully through this discussion, but also through the discussion with the major, developers or, the banks, and we could really, put this issue on the table. How in the future those infrastructures can be better planned in terms of their location, better planned in terms of their operation, and better planned in terms of the financing, so as to at least, minimize. We use the hierarchies, avoid, minimize, then compensate if any impact on wetlands. So I think that should be the first starting point from my side. Secondly, I think you already mentioned the enabling conditions for the private sector to invest into the wetlands. Certainly, it's true. We need the enabling, environment. For example, in how many countries there's still lack of legislation to recognize that wetlands, they are not wastelands. I lost the track. Probably colleagues from RAMSAR Secretariat can tell us, in terms of wetlands, legislation, in how many countries wetlands has been recognized as the natural resources. It's not a wasteland anymore. In my own country, China, that I came from, decades ago, yes, wetlands was treated as wasteland. So you can imagine, in the absence of that legislation framework, it's hard to talk about wetlands, conservation, etc., etc. Countries who already put up their legislation, for example, US, they already have the zero net, loss of the national target. And in the past decades, then the total, natural, at least the natural wetlands, the area stays. So the countries where they have set up the legislation framework, generally we can say they have been doing much, much better in terms of wetlands sustainable use and wetland conservation. So that is my second message. The third one, it's really about trade-off difficulties. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. Because wetlands provide so much services, both as the habitat for species, for biodiversity, but also in terms of climate regulation, water purification, you name it. Yeah, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment have very detailed, report. Also, the IPIPs have a very detailed, reports on the ecosystem services that are provided by the wetlands. So when it comes to investment, it's really need to look at all these, services and make the financial decision, which you have to deal with all these trade-offs. We should not forget, in fact, many of those services is still like being treated as the common good rather than something you can easily put some price tag on. For example, the carbon sequestered by the peatland. It's even it's much higher and much more carbon sequestered in the peatland, compared to the other kinds of forest. But then that's kinds of issues, you have to have this legislation framework, but also when you're doing any, investment, that would be something you will have to look at that, which also links to the other solutions potentially I'm going to mention. So let's treat wetlands as a asset rather than a liability. So that's mindset has to be changed. And also to treat wetlands as an asset rather than a liability, we will have to really rely on the scientists help us to do much better job in terms of the auditing of wetlands values, wetlands ecosystem services that's provided by the wetlands. Lastly, we do have the opportunity in terms of mobilizing resources, especially from the private sector, and that's the carbon market. Unfortunately, at the moment, the carbon price on the global market is very low. It's very low. I think that's probably one of the opportunities that for this community we need to look at. Hopefully this week at the Sharm el-Sheikh, so the negotiators can make some progress to improve the regulation and raise the global carbon price, and that certainly will benefit lots of the works related to this. But that would be something. Look at how the wetlands, the ecosystem services, like the carbon sequestration provided by the wetlands, can help to attract some of the financial flows in the future. So hopefully that's contributed to the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. So sorry about the technical difficulties. So before, I'm afraid we might lose Mr. Sibanda, I would like to pass the floor to him. Mr. Sibanda, what is the Commonwealth Secretariat's experience in mobilizing private sector finance for climate resilience and nature-based solution projects? Mr. Sibanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and just want to say thank you to Andreas and your team for the invitation and organizing this important event at the RAMSAR COP in Geneva. I'm unable to be with you in person because we are here in Sharm el-Sheikh supporting our member countries of the Commonwealth with the ongoing process, UNFCCC process to address climate change and ensure our civilization survives this climate emergency and prospers in the process. For some of you that may not be aware, I work for the Commonwealth, which is a voluntary association of 56 independent and equal member states in all parts of the world, working for democracy, peace, and sustainable development. The environment, and particularly climate change and nature conservation, have been concerns that the Commonwealth has held for many years. In fact, even before the Rio Conventions were established, the Commonwealth leaders sounded the alarm on the crisis that we are facing currently. I think this is important for us from the Commonwealth angle because as many of you might know, a number actually many of our member countries are part and parcel of the RAMSAR Convention. The latest accession from the Commonwealth is from Vanuatu. But when you look at the RAMSAR sites around the world, the Commonwealth has some of its members with the largest sites, whether you look at a country like Australia, Canada, with over 13 million hectares of sites, or the numbers, the UK and the overseas territories. I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but the wetlands are important for climate regulation, biodiversity, flood protection, fresh water abundance and quality food, fiber, shelter, for the health and well-being of many across the world. And I think Lee does make a point about the fact that in many places they've been taken as their value has not been well appreciated, because they do contribute to economies in significant ways. My role anyway this afternoon is just to share our experience in mobilizing finance in support of our member countries. And for us, this has been done through the Climate Finance Access Hub, which we often abbreviate as CFA. This was established in 2015 and operationalized in 2016 with the aim of really increasing the resilience of our member countries through access to finance, which often they face barriers, some of them process ones. Processes are cumbersome, whether you're looking at GCF or a number of sources of funding, and often require specialized expertise and capacity. So as CFA, we support our member countries through a hub and spokes model. And this is important because we deploy finance advisors to specific countries to really look at how they can help mobilize finances specific to country situations. And they do this through concrete project development, because that is very important, support of the climate policy environment, readiness, accreditation support. Some of the barriers to finance, particularly from institutions like GCF, are around institutional accreditational support for countries. And then we do human and institutional capacity development. An important part of what we do is around knowledge management and learning. I want to share three elements really of what we've learned so far. Some of it has probably been in response to some of the issues that Andreas did raise in his brief talk, and Lee did mention as well. One of the things that we have done in, and this has been through, but I'll just point out an example from Eswatini, and we've done similar work as well in Zambia, has been actually to support the countries with looking at their policy environment, at their climate finance, do climate finance mapping in order to really work on then developing concrete propositions to the private sector. This is very, very critical and important if countries are going to generate interest from the private sector and be able to speak with the private sector in ways that they can understand and appreciate. One of the challenges has been that oftentimes policymakers and governments don't speak the language of the private sector, and the private sector cannot speak the language of policy. And so there has to be that initial policy framework type of work to support the processes to enable investment. And I think that is critical when one looks at wetlands and any other nature-based solution. The second part really that I just want to briefly talk about. So perhaps maybe before I go there, I'll just mention that in Eswatini, we have supported the country to develop a private sector strategy. And the private sector strategy really focused on identifying the gaps, proposing solutions, and formulating together with the stakeholders, both private and government, a plan of action that has been followed. And what has concretely come out of that is that, private sector has seen the opportunities that exist within the sector, where they can actually make a dent on climate, but also invest and make a profit. And we're already seeing some interest from private companies to invest in line with that strategy and plan. But there has to be the development of that strategy. In Zambia, we supported the country to do a climate finance mapping exercise. And that identified sectors where the private sector could invest. And that has been important in helping get a conversation with the private sector to actually do that. And that's important now in taking that work forward. The other work that we've done, which I think oftentimes is often the focus of these conversations, has been around issues, innovative financial instruments. And these bring huge sums of money and can address not just climate change, but also some challenges that the governments are facing. And so we've worked in Belize on climate debt swaps and issuance of blue bonds, and similar work has also been done in Jamaica. These are critical for drawing capital investment from the private sector, particularly whether you're dealing with sovereign funds, pension funds, insurance companies. And it has done one important thing for developing countries, which is also address issues of debt. And in Belize, we've supported the country with the information, because this is very specialized, with information for policymakers to fully understand this, on how they can restructure their debts, but also make sure that that is linked to climate action, to ocean action. And so one of the things I think that needs to be facilitated in making sure that countries access finance from the private sector is that sort of capacity building around these sorts of issues, and bringing the relevant investors and intermediaries to really work on these and make sure that the savings or proceeds from the debt swap then benefit nature and benefit wetlands. My reflections on these things, and I think I'm closing now, are that I think for many countries, it's important when we think about the private sector to actually also think about the medium, small, and enterprises, because these are often the drivers of their economies. So oftentimes we think about huge finance, but it's important that countries develop strategies that are appropriate for micro, small, medium, and large private sectors. The second issue, I think, is that, and this is a challenge to many of us who are working in this sector, is to develop bankable projects. And I worked in WWF for many years. And countries need to have a pipeline of projects that they can suggest and promote to the private sector to invest in. Sectoral engagement needs to be part of the process. Capacity building needs to be part of the process. Andreas did mention that oftentimes the private sector gets limited in terms of how they can engage because of issues to do with the predictable policy environment that's not there. So we need to address that. The last point I would share with all of you is that from my experience, knowledge exchange between countries, amongst countries, is very critical. And for us, CIFA has provided that. And we hope that as we interact with many of you in the sector, particularly for us as Commonwealth, because we've just begun, we've got an endorsement for a Living Lands Charter, is that we will interact and share information and be able to support countries in this space. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Savanda. And apologies for the technical difficulties. We can all see you, so that's fine. I know you can now no longer see us, but so we'd like to move on. I would like to kindly ask the speakers, if possible, just keeping note of the time to try and be a little bit more succinct, if it's possible. Our next speaker will be Ms. Julia Carbone, and we asked Ms. Julia what could be the role of climate finance for wetland conservation. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'll try to be short because also, I mean, the work, speaking about the voluntary carbon market could be a lecture of various hours, and that's not what I'm here for. But just to give you some context, my role is in the NCS alliances to catalyze demand for high quality natural climate solution carbon credits. So every word counts there. So we are talking about NCS carbon credits. So we are not talking about all the type of finance for natural climate solutions. We are talking about natural climate solutions, which are nature-based solutions addressing climate change. So it's just like other nature-based solutions, we actually abide by the definition of UN Environment Program. So there are solutions that are there to protect, manage, restore nature, and also generates biodiversity gains and socioeconomic benefits, in addition to addressing societal challenges, in this case, we are talking about climate. And it's about demand. So there are a number of things that I wanted to mention. I think, well, of course, as a coalition, we are a group of companies, NGOs, and solution providers in the space of carbon market. We believe that this could be a really great opportunity to complement all the other tools in the toolkit that we have to mobilize to reach global net zero. But it's also a great opportunity because it can finance biodiversity conservation, which is also a huge crisis, which we don't get into that now, but is a crisis because of the loss, and it's a crisis because of the lack of funding. So the climate finance could really become an interesting vector to bring finance to nature. In terms of potential, in 2021, the voluntary carbon market generated $2 billion, and it traded 500,000 gigaton, basically 500,000 credits, 500 gigaton of credits. Sorry, half of this, so 250,000 more or less, came from forest and land-based use changes, solutions that are related to forest management, land use change. Now, they don't use in the statistics, they don't use nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions because it doesn't exist as a methodology, as a category. But basically, they have put all the methodologies that are about protection of forest, reforestation, including peatlands and so on, into that category. So we are talking about 250,000. The understanding in the voluntary carbon market is that there is a potential for the voluntary carbon market to contribute up to 1 gigaton a year. So we have to create 4 times more demand and supply for these credits. And this is one part of the contribution that nature can do to climate. So that's the other important thing, that nature can contribute much more. And I'm looking at data that has been generated recently by Conservation International, where they put basically around 13 gigaton of contribution that nature can have by 2030, divided by protection, management, which has the biggest role, and restoration, which has the smallest role. And the reason why we always mention protect, manage, and restore in this sequence is because it's really the sequence we should look at this really. First and foremost, protect what is standing, then improve management, and then restore. So going back to the voluntary carbon market and this 1 gigaton a year, great potential, great opportunity for climate, great opportunity for financing nature. But there are a number of challenges, and this is also where there is a lot of criticisms, and you will hear a lot from Sharm in the next few days about this, because there is, some, and I think fairly so, are afraid that the use of or the purchase of carbon credits by companies will undermine their efforts to decarbonize. Fair point. What is important is, well, we need to decide as a society, do we want to have either or approach, or if we want to embark in and approach, because we need everything at the table right now, given the crisis, we have to define very strong guardrails for the use of credits and implement them. So the Natural Climate Solution Alliance has identified guardrails, and these are now being also developed into a code, a claim code that is being developed by the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. Once that code is developed, then it's going to be easier to define this company A is doing it, is using credits in the correct way. That company is greenwashing. Until then, it's based on our judgment and looking at that. We have a number of companies that have demonstrated that they have science-based targets. They are well on their journey to net zero, and they have calculated their annual unabated emissions, and they only purchase credits to counterbalance those, which is a lot of wording to say it's not an alternative to decarbonization, it's not the old school offsetting, is really in addition. So these companies are doing, scope 1, 2, and 3 decarbonization. They could sit there and say, that's it. But instead they said, no, we do more and we invest more. So there are a number of companies doing this. We need many more because we need to mobilize. It's not just the finance, as I said, but we need to get closer. Any ton counts in terms of getting to net zero. The other important element, and I know I'm running out of time, is these credits have to be high quality. Again, one little word to say a lot of things. Not only they have to have high carbon integrity, and there's a long list, which I'm not going to read to you, about what are the characteristics of high integrity, but let me mention two. One is additionality. So the project, not just financially, but also in terms of outcomes, climate mitigation outcome, is additional to a baseline. So this wouldn't have happened without the voluntary carbon market. Not easy to demonstrate, because even on projects related to renewable energy today, is the market penetration of renewable energy high enough to require still voluntary carbon market or not? There is no answer yet. We have different perspectives, I'm sure. And additionality, of course, and permanence. How long is the climate mitigation is going to stay? And of course, with nature, we know that there is very tricky, and it's not just because men can change ideas and change the destination of the land. One day is conserved, and we know this from protected area. We all worked in this. One day is conserved, the other day is a palm oil plantation. But it's also because you have natural hazards like fires. You have all heard the stories of last year. The buffer pool that was used by one of the carbon crediting program went out in fire in the US. So very complicated, but possible. But the high quality also include the making sure that the interventions, so the projects or the jurisdictional program, also delivers biodiversity gains. So this is very important. We are saying this is not just about safeguards, making sure that the projects or programs do no harm. We should not miss this opportunity for these interventions to actually protect, restore, and manage, protect, manage, and restore nature. This is really important. However, what is the challenge is that we don't have common metrics to define that. We have common metrics to measure climate mitigation outcomes, but for biodiversity, as we know, there are plenty of metrics, but something specific for, natural climate solution to say, yes, we have had a biodiversity gain. And the same applies, even more importantly, for socioeconomic. So people, communities, local communities, indigenous peoples, are they benefiting from these interventions? Are they really getting a benefit? Do they have better jobs? Do they have better quality of life? Do they have security? Some projects have demonstrated incredible improvements, but not all. And again, there is a lack at the moment of common metrics to enable businesses that want to purchase to be able to say, this one is a high quality credit. So I leave it to that. There is much more I would like to say. I mean, I had lots of notes, but just to say the Natural Climate Solution Alliance is really working on these issues. We are tackling head on the question about procurement. So we are coming up with ideas on what are the questions that the procurement officers in a company can start asking project developers, which are usually the intermediaries between what happens on the ground and the market, in terms of, biodiversity and social aspects. We have lots of, there are a number of standards looking at climate, but we need to start diving deeper on the biodiversity and social aspects as well. So I leave it to that. Happy to answer other questions and explore which companies are behind this and how we can all contribute and support this. And actually, I had some ideas on how we can create a better link with the wetlands and the Ramsar side. So I'm sure we can discuss this during the Q&A.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so our next speaker will be Mr. Bart Hagemeyer, and we asked, what are some considerations for private sector with regards to wetlands conservation as well?
Thank you very much. And I think in the previous presentation or talk, you saw several slides in the background that we're bringing you hopefully in the spirit of what these wetland landscapes look like, because we've heard a lot about the very important initiatives that are being taken to make the finance available and the complexities around finding ways to make that finance land appropriately in the landscape. Where Wetlands International works is in those landscapes and try to, in those wetland landscapes, work with all the stakeholders to bring about that change, that transformational change that is needed. And the climate financing can be a very important catalyst there. You use that word catalyst, and I think that's really what it could do, because there's a whole range of stakeholders in these landscapes, and these landscapes provide services to all those stakeholders. And those stakeholders are human, but it also includes the silent stakeholders like nature and biodiversity. And those are easily overlooked. Climate change is impacting on all those stakeholders, including on the wetlands. And the wetlands are part of the solution as well as have a negative effect from the climate change. So it's important to consider that they're on both ends of that spectrum. And where they are part of the solution, they can be that in terms of both the mitigation and the adaptation. Another important thing to notice, I think. Besides the direct impact of climate change, there's also the impact that responses to climate change have on wetlands, because there's many traditional business as usual responses that look at single aspects in a landscape, put in a solution, and that in turn can also have a very negative effect on the wetlands, and in turn on the services that the wetland provides to other stakeholders. And therefore, they often benefit part of the stakeholders in the landscape, but not many others. It was said before, transformative change is needed. And including wetland-based solutions in that change and in addressing those challenges is not only a logical thing to do because of all the benefits it provides, but it also can be economically very, very, very sensible to do that. And there's a lot of facilitative efforts that are needed to start doing that, and that's also where climate finance can come in at a very low level of facilitating the processes that allow stakeholders to come together and identify how to move forward in a landscape towards those solutions. And of course, a multifunctional landscape, wetland landscape, with all its stakeholders typically does include the private sector. And there's many examples of where conservation projects have gone about not including that private sector because they were kind of difficult to approach or considered the enemy. And we've seen many of those solutions working for a while, but in the end, not being sustainable or lasting because they have not been inclusive enough. So in working towards those solutions in those wetland landscapes, and I think it is true in any landscape actually, it is of crucial importance to be inclusive, involve all the stakeholders. Omitting stakeholders will result in solutions that over time are not lasting because one of them is not happy and will, well, break the agreement or move in a different direction. As I said, companies, private sector are often considered difficult stakeholders to deal with. However, they do provide a very strongly positive contribution to social and economic conditions like jobs and infrastructure. And they're also, by others, often considered to have negative impacts on several of the values in the landscape, including the wetlands. It is very important to take a step back and consider how can we do better with them, inclusive. And in most cases, they make use of the natural resources and depend on them. They have a very strong capacity to make change happen, to be very much able to achieve their objectives. So if they can be gotten behind the common objective, they can be very strong vehicle for change. So expressing and understanding the interests of all the stakeholders in a landscape is one of the initial processes that need to happen. And facilitating those processes is where even large-scale financing can help. It's often small investments in bringing stakeholders together, all the stakeholders, including the private sector, making them see each other's interest in the landscape and think together about solutions that help to all of them, therefore inclusive solutions as well. Based on that, they can start to invent new solutions that are not just the typical ones, but ones that actually combine benefits for one with benefits of other. And if you make stakeholders work together like that, there's many examples of very new and innovative solutions coming forward and being able to make it possible to create sustainable solutions in a landscape. It may sound rather theoretical, but there are many cases out there in the world where it is demonstrated that these kind of processes of really going through a consensus building a process together involving the climate, the private sector, are demonstrably more successful than those where it has not happened and where over time people have stepped out because they didn't see how the solution was contributing for them as well. I'm convinced that what you do in your evaluation unit must bring about these patterns as well. You've looked at many of the interventions that you've done and you've looked how does it generate successes. And I'm convinced that these type of really low-level bottom-up processes of bringing stakeholders together, making them see each other's interests, and then defining new solutions that are often centered around these wetland-based benefits, that they can contribute to large-scale solutions as well. Wetlands International is following this approach, and we have many successful examples that we can contribute. There's other very large-scale examples of this, and one that I would like to mention without going into the detail of it is the success of how the trilateral Wadden Sea between the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark has been seen the coming together of all the stakeholders, from those that were very much opposed to development to those that would want to develop it for oil and gas, etc. Everybody together working on a blueprint for how in the future this site could be used and also be a World Heritage Site for its biodiversity. And it's working. It is possible to generate these kind of solutions where everybody lives together in a landscape. It is supporting a huge tourism sector. It is still delivering gas for a number of countries. Commercial fisheries are happening, and biodiversity is still thriving. There are solutions like that where the process has been very successful in bringing interests together and resulting in common solutions that really work. And I would hope that in selecting cases for green climate funding, these kind of landscape-based bottom-up processes could become eligible and would benefit from those kind of injections of money. And they would probably not need to be hundreds of millions. Those could be relatively small interventions that facilitate the coming together of these bottom-up solutions that could be the basis for very large-scale leveraging of other financing that will actually be generated in the region itself. I think I'll stop there and thanks for open.
Thank you, Ward. So just in terms of, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping in terms of the timing. We did start 5 minutes later, so if you have 5 minutes more or even longer, as well as the panelists, then maybe if you still have time and if they still have time, we can have a little bit of a Q&A section afterwards. But I do know the session was supposed to end 2 minutes ago. But we have 2 more. Well, I would like to ask Raphael Glemet to have his intervention as well. And then I would like to ask Dr. Seliger to do some closing remarks based off of what he's heard. And then again, if there's more time for the people who have time, we can engage in a bit of a Q&A discussion. Raphael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I had my notes, which I only enriched through the intervention of others, which were very interesting, but I'll try to shorten all that in maybe 2-3 minutes, possibly 5. So I heard a lot about seeing wetlands as an asset and not a liability, de-risking the investments on wetlands, and really convincing financial models, funds and banks in investing largely in wetlands and convincing also governments. The numbers are here. I think we see them on the screen. 8% of the total Earth surface are covered by wetlands, but their soil hold more than 35% of the total organic carbon that is stored overall in the soil. The peatlands, I think there's a nice quote on the screen, only 3% of the surface area of all land on Earth, almost nothing, but they contain 450 gigaton of carbon. This is twice as much as all of the world's forest biomass combined. So why don't we have efforts in terms of restoring, maintaining wetlands as a climate infrastructure as much as we have in the forest sector, for example, through FLR, REDD+, and everything that, is quite becoming mainstream. Wetlands are also supporting adaptation and buffering floods, droughts, coastal storms. So there's really a combination of services, both on mitigation and adaptation, which can hardly be separated. And maybe the GCF tries to do that a bit too much on adaptation and mitigation. We can come back to it. In addition, wetlands bring other benefits, groundwater recharge, support to livelihoods, ecotourism, and of course, biodiversity. So there's really a need to integrate them within climate strategies and across all sectors. There's an estimate that ecosystem-based adaptation can cover as much as 30 or 35% of mitigation and a similar number for adaptation for the global targets. So we can't do without nature-based solution, and a large part of this is contributed by wetlands. So if countries want to achieve their targets, they have to restore wetlands. They have to take that into account. We won't do everything with nature, but we also cannot succeed without it. And wetlands are an immense part of the success. Despite this, I think we heard that the wetlands are disappearing. I'm based in Asia, and we can see that pretty much every day, at least every month, that projects are happening that are encroaching on wetlands, despite sometimes some strong legal framework on wetlands protection, but are conflicting with other policies and a lack of coordination. So how can finance and climate finance help, and how can it be really transformative? I think we hear a lot about taking it to scale, transformative approach, paradigm shift, and it's a lot in how we allocate finance. So there's, of course, a need to support financially governments. There's limited government funding for wetlands management. That's a chronic problem. But the solutions, actually, this ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solution that we're talking about are not necessarily very expensive. And this is maybe not where the transformation lies, or only, it's a combination of things. Of course, the involvement of the private sector is critical, with a serious barrier in terms of poorly developed value chain linked to wetlands. Again, compared to forests, we're way behind. And that limits really the smallholder adoption on sound private sector approaches on wetlands. Businesses face high barriers and lack of access to technology and market. They need to be a sustainable business model. So GCF does bring this support in terms of de-risking the investment. Projects are often built around a blended finance, public and private, and really trying to show again that wetlands are an asset and not a liability. So I think as part of many of the nature-based solution or ecosystem-based approach in the GCF, we see really the support to bringing the private sector to kind of a market-ready portfolio of options on ecosystem services and their maintenance. But we still see that countries are very reluctant in taking some of the loans from global or regional banks because they see investment in nature as high risk. So there's really a shift in how we need to bring governments to understand that this is a high value investment and not high risk. And GCF really has this potential through the funding to de-risking again the investment and enabling then a combination with loans and other approach. There's a need for framework also to make sure that when we talk about nature-based solution on wetlands or other ecosystems, we are talking about real ecosystem approaches. I think Julia mentioned it. Nature-based solution that will provide societal challenge, so tackling climate issue, also biodiversity benefit, which is often forgotten, working at the right scale, working with the right governance, including civil society, economically sound, and also leading to policy transformation. So frameworks are needed. An example is IUCN developed a global standard on nature-based solution, which guides with designer, implementer, and people in charge for monitoring nature-based solution. So we make sure that we're all talking about the same thing and all the criteria are there. We're trying to move the standard to a certification process so private sector can see a value in terms of following those steps and really designing sound nature-based solution. A type of stakeholder I haven't heard about or heard of in the meetings are the CSOs. So we talk about enabling environment, which is government and private sector. Our experience demonstrates that the CSOs are a key actor, not only in implementing nice restoration program on wetlands, but also in identifying investment approach. We had a regional program in Asia that delivered, I think, 17 grants on ecosystem-based adaptation directly for CSOs. They were designed mostly with this approach of restoring, sustaining the wetlands for the multiple benefits. And what was interesting is the return we got through the reports and the outcomes of all those low scale, so smaller scale approach was clear opportunities for finance development, for engagement with private sector, things that we hadn't foreseen. We thought we knew the site, but really CSO had this capacity to understand, work with government, work with private sector, and start developing a portfolio of action. This is not perfect, and this is where, again, the GCF can invest in working with CSOs, bringing this capacity in understanding the climate angle, understanding the private sector angle, and really working with them and the network of CSO to kind of get this nice portfolio of action that are possible on the private sector level. And finally, and I hope that will be my last point, sorry if I'm a bit long, but there's no transformation without policy transformation. That's the most difficult. And I think I see a few people I know in the room that are working close to the ground and site. And we know that sometimes we are working with the Ministry of Environment or environmental agency on protecting a wetland, but at the same time, other ministries, other agencies have other policies that are pushing for rice production, 3 crops per year, a lot of water use. So this is conflicting. We can have large-scale implementation of nature-based solution. If the policy framework doesn't change, then in the long term, we don't have the paradigm shift or the transformation we expect. So it's very important also for GCF to take that not as the nice little side last component of a project, but to put that in the center of the proposal. So that includes building some kind of host for this policy change. So climate change agencies that we really look at nature as one of the tools, looking at tailored support to governments in terms of revising their policy, helping them enforcing them, documenting good practices in terms of policy at local level as well that can inform the national level. So I think that that'll be it. But I think in terms of approach, as you know, both a GCF agency, but also a recipient of funds from other donors, I think we see some flexibility in other climate funding from IKI, from the Adaptation Fund that can provide really the space for policy, and working strongly with GCF also in terms of coordination, where GCF can really bring all that to a much higher level. So that'll be it for now, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Sorry if I've been a bit long.
Thank you, Raphael. And then I'd like to bring in Dr. Seliger for some closing words and remarks, and if you still have time, then we can have a bit of a discussion. Dr. Seliger, the floor is yours.
Excellent presentations. Some points. Why should the private sector engage? Two motives: feeling good, CSR, ESG, or profit. And sometimes it's mixed. Voluntary use for action used for marketing. The profit motive is much stronger, but much more difficult to understand. But I think here wetlands have quite some advantages, obvious profit motives like tourism, harvesting wetlands, fisheries, aquaculture, even gas, and monetization of wetlands as carbon sinks that would come. The track record is nevertheless poor, as you said. And I say, for one example, I see EAFPs here. The track record is very poor. We have 18 countries, 23 NGOs, and one company. And if I ask, because I'm a latecomer to EAFP, if I ask the people, what's with this company, they say, oh, we don't know, it's a historic legacy. There's no room for them. And it's also a fault, if you want to say so, or it's also a task for the CSO and for the governments to make this room. One word on risk. The business risk clearly in your programs has to remain with the businesses. No bailout, no moral hazard. But covering the political risk or part of it through changing regulations, through strings attached, and working as an actor, creating the loan market for this risk, is I think what the GCF should do. And on an individual wetland by wetland basis, we can see it works quite well. And we have been also a few weeks ago to the Wadden and Ward said how good it is there. And just one figure on that, in Denmark, when they started 15 years ago with their wetland, with their Wadden National Park, more than 50% said we want immediately to stop this program. And in the last opinion poll, they had only 1% said it. And that was very, very good. But you might say, for a track record, you need a track record. That is, we have to collect these good examples, and that would be maybe also a thing GCF could do in the independent evaluation unit to work on that. Clearly, over time, ESG, CSR became much more important for high-income countries, like in Germany, the Lufthansa sponsors the German Crane Association because of the sign they have. These are good examples, I think. But also for less wealthy countries, it could be attractive. And we worked as Hans Seidel Foundation in North Korea with CDM projects for 6 years. That worked well because there was a profit motive for them. It didn't work in the end because of politics. But from 2015 with IUCN and others, we worked on wetlands. And even there, clearly we dangle a carrot in front of them and say ecotourism, but it's a little bit risky because we cannot really, if we want to do it good for the nature, it's very, very difficult to say this will in the end bring the same like destroying your nature. So there has to be some more thoughts on that. So we should be also honest with it. If you want to protect the wetlands, there's also a cost attached, not only a benefit. And the last point, the transboundary aspect, I'm very happy because it's so important. And I think, for example, because I'm a European, probably others would have other examples, the EU shows how to do it. We have this border region promotion projects, Interact or LEADER, and a similar design adapted to biodiversity and wetlands would be probably very, very helpful, where you have the requirement 2 or 3 states have to work together, and then certain environmental aspects could be sponsored by that. And I'm really very excited to be here at this fascinating panel. Thank you.
Thank you to all of the panelists for your interesting interventions. I'd like to open it up to the floor for questions. Does anyone have a question? You can please raise your hand or just start asking. Anyone? Well, okay, we have one at the back, sir. Please.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for some very interesting presentations on a very important matter, because we all know that it's often really difficult to get the the needed amount of financing for doing nature and biodiversity conservation. I'm Michael from Denmark, the Danish National Environmental Protection Agency, by the way. So my question is, we have sort of been talking very much about the general issues covering these aspects. But what I would really like to hear was some more concrete examples about how can we get through to the private investors to have a long-term support with money to support especially biodiversity conservation programs or projects. What are the investors' payoff that makes them continue their support for many years? I would really like to hear you come with some really nice concrete examples, or maybe you could refer to some stories about this on the internet. That would be really valuable, because sometimes it's a bit difficult to go for the large perspective and down to how can we actually approach the private investors to make something happen. Could you do this, please?
That's a question to me, but just to clarify, I'm by by profession I'm an evaluator, so I'm the one that's critical to all these different processes. Never mind that. There are credible examples. We've got actually a couple of them here in the room as well. We've got Uganda, a GCF project that looks in the wetlands, and we've got a couple of colleagues sitting here, so I'm really pleased to have them here as well. The one question that one would ask, at least from a climate perspective, when it comes to private sector, is what is the private sector? And we went around in the GCF office in Songdo, South Korea, 200 staff members, and we asked, what do you think is the private sector? And we got from 250 people, 300 different answers. So here you see the dilemma. It's not very clear on what we mean by private sector. Is it a financial sector? Is it an international financial sector, the local financial sector? So an agricultural bank that wants to invest in something a little bit more than only agriculture, but looking at ecosystem services and how a landscape approach can really work, or is it an international investor such as HSBC or Deutsche Asset Management, who are accredited entities with the GCF and have projects with the GCF, or is it an impact investor? A small social enterprise that looks at a regional problem and regional aspects, such as a small grid a system that would help to reduce to provide energy for cooking, to reduce the cut of wood fuel. So there are tangible projects of that sort that explain of how the private sector has been involved in either the project development and implementation, or as a co-investor to say, okay, yes, we want to invest in this as well, because we're working on a landscape approach and trying to not look at our projects in singular views, but looking at the entire environment as such. So we've got incredible examples in Senegal where an agricultural bank does that with the GCF. We have many more examples of Acumen looking as an impact investor, looking at the question of cook stoves, of locally driven energy grids, autonomous and energy grids as an example. That it's not much of a wetlands direction right now that I'm taking, but it does show you the linkages between different sectors. So the reduction of wood fuel means that the people don't go into the nature and chopping up random trees or even going into habitats and ecosystems that are important to the areas where they live. So these are examples. Another example, as I said, is sitting right there from Uganda on the wetlands management. It's a GCF funded project as well. They're are such projects out there. So I'm happy to guide you to the internet, as you mentioned. Thanks.
Does anyone else from the audience have questions? Sir, please.
Yes, thank you. I thank you very much to all the presenters. Oh, I don't know if I'm audible. Okay, good. Yes, I'm from Eswatini, and it's interesting to hear that one of the panelist members, Mr. Sibanda, was citing an example of our situation in Eswatini. I think what is very important to note is that we've done our own international assessments, of course, working with Dr. Sibanda and others. What we have observed, we are not contributors of note to the climate change scenario, but we are recipients in terms of the bad stuff that is coming from, you know, the changing climate. So that being said, I think it's very good that we actually energize, especially even the civil society actors, that they come on board, the private sector, they come on board. But one cannot help but wonder, you know, how can we keep them in the long term? Because as you know, they are there. If it makes business sense, you will have them. And if not, they will take a shortcut or a short left. So I think it's very important that we continue to work in this vein, and also that you know, developing all the legislations, the policies is also important. But at some point, you know, they just remain that they remain on the shelf. So what can always keep us working together? It is such forums where we keep, you know, advancing, keep thinking of new ways on which to address the challenges, because there will always be upcoming challenges. Thank you very much for sharing, you know, this possible avenue in this regard. Thank you.
I think we can take maybe one more question, and then we might have to close because we are very over time. And thank you very much for staying. Do we have any question here? You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas, for the very interesting coverage of your assessment. I was wondering, when you talked about operational culture, did you find any best practices for us as big institutions, for example, IUCN, where we were able, where someone was able to effectively streamline their work and make us more able to react when we're working with the private sector?
Yeah, thanks again for that question. Yeah, there's operational, you know, operational culture and organizational culture is a big question. That's also a big question for the GCF. So again, the GCF has the mandate to integrate private sector considerations and the private sector as such through co-investments or catalyzing finance to climate action. But at the same time, we're struggling with it as an international organization, because we most often have people that have experiences from, you know, all sorts of international organizations, Wetlands International, FAO, IUCN, you name it. And so what we found is most important is two things. One, we would have to look for the professionals in this space that have an interest and a keen interest to look a little bit beyond the financial parts, looking into the question of nature. So in my previous work prior to the GCF, what we did is we integrated university programs in that direction. So I used to work for the CGIAR, and one thing that we found to be very successful is to train the future leaders in these spaces about these considerations of nature, about these considerations of climate. That's obviously a long-term goal. That's nothing that you can, you know, that would help you change your culture right away, but it does bring you at least some sort of base for the future to address these questions in a more succinct way. The second thing that we felt was what was needed is relationship management. As soon as you start, and it's really an easy thing. As soon as you start an honest and a direct conversation, that has been far more successful than anything else with the engagement with the private sector, because what I mentioned with predictability is really key. It is not so much about how long the process at the end takes. It's far more about how can we make each other understand that expectations are different and expectations need to be aligned. So that relationship management was key for some of the successes that we've had.
Thank you. I have Dr. Subanda and then Julia. I think they wanted to make some comments as well. Dr. Subanda first, you.
Thank you very much. I'm unable to read the room, but I just wanted to make one or two comments. I think it's important that we all continue to do some interesting analysis at country levels to prepare for private sector investment. I think oftentimes the question about where could private sector invest and what returns could come through, you need to take a strategic approach and have conversations with the private sector in that regard. I mean, you could look at, various products and whether, you're looking at manure or you're looking at fertilizers for agriculture, you're looking at production of things like cement, construction, all those sectors, or even insurance, there are potentials of the private sector being involved. But I think what we've discovered is that oftentimes those conversations are not happening, and governments, private sector, and civil society need to have those conversations and strategize going forward. I think we have some examples, whether you're looking at biotrade, wild trade, and people have been doing interesting work. There are champions out there that have already done pioneered stuff, and I think it's important to be able to leverage on those things going forward in order to make sure that continued private sector interest is obtained, and we maximize on that going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, so just very quickly, and to add to what you were saying, Andreas, is of course it's important to help businesses understand the value of nature and make sure that they become better managers in the future, incorporating also that values. And I would say not just nature, but also, equity. But there is also the other side of the coin, is help NGOs also be able to speak better than business language. And at IUCN, well, I'm not at IUCN anymore, but when I was there, that's we did a very strong program about helping building capacity of NGOs on how to engage with business. And it is some of these things for those who actually speak with business regularly seems obvious, but are not always obvious. And there are a lot of techniques that needs to be that can be shared. And don't underestimate the importance of getting people to the table with businesses, people that feel comfortable and confident, because otherwise the conversations can really go down very badly. And at the end of the day, when you're talking with the business, it's a business that has to make a profit. It is a business. It's not a not-for-profit. So I think that's the biggest difference and needs to be incorporated in the way we talk between business and NGOs. So there are a lot of opportunities, but not necessarily always will make business sense. So also that I think it's important.
Thank you. I think this is a very interesting conversation, and I want to just give the opportunity to any of the panelists to say some final words, because I think we probably have to close pretty soon. Does anyone else want to have some closing words, quick, short closing words? Yeah, Mr. Hackmeyer.
Thank you. The latest words from both the room and from Julia really enforce the point that I tried to make in my intervention as well, is that facilitating the process is probably a very wise investment, rather than trying to make things happen by only implementing direct action. And yeah, it's a bit like how do you deal with the restoring mangroves? So you can plant the trees, but the better way is really to create the conditions for it to come back. And here also in landscapes, the interactions between the stakeholders, making people able to talk to the companies and find each other in common solutions, is probably where the beginning of the sustainable solutions lie. And then the landscape will be ready to receive big scale investments as well to make the transformational change. But the beginning of those change processes are often very basic, making people work together.
Does anyone else have any closing words? Raphael?
No, nothing to add to that. I think that was a good conclusion. Yeah.
Well, then with that, I'd like to thank again my distinguished panelists and for the audience for your interesting questions and your engagement and your patience and attention. And I wish you guys a good rest of your conference. Thank you very much.